George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
An 80-year-old woman has just been stabbed to death by a 20-year-old in Tunbridgewells. When disgusting reaches Tunbridgewells, Keir Starmer is definitely in trouble after a mere 51 or 52 days in power. And the German Nationalist Party, the AfD, is poised to win an historic election in the regional polls taking place this weekend in Germany. Details as they emerge. Fascism is on the march in the West, not dressed in swastikas, but in liberal garb. Under the cloak of liberalism, everything that liberalism said that it stood for is being abolished. Here in Britain, a 61-year-old woman, Sarah Wilkinson, admired and respected across the land, was raided and arrested by 12 police officers. 12! Some of them wearing balaclavas, for a tweet that she wrote some time ago defending the Palestinians from genocide. And in France, little Macron is going nap. Not only did he arrest the owner, founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, having invited him to dinner at the Elysee in fine mafioso tradition. He's run rumble out of town and he's playing footsie with Marine Le Pen, defying the result of his own general election, called by himself. And in Palestine, the killing goes on and on and on. It's all coming up in the next 2 hours. Fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy night because this is the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
The crime wave in Britain is getting out of control and it's spreading beyond London. Tunbridge Wells, of all places, an 80-year-old woman has just been murdered, stabbed to death by a 20-year-old who is in custody. All over the country, oftentimes in places like Bournemouth that you would never associate with high violent crime, people are being stabbed and shot on a daily basis. And the government, the Home Secretary, she has no apparent interest, more interested in cracking down on tweets on social media. Her police force raided Sarah Wilkinson with 12 officers at dawn in traditional fascist style. Many of the police officers wearing balaclavas to arrest a 61-year-old woman over a tweet. A woman, moreover, who is highly respected across the country. An entirely peaceful woman, doing her best to uphold international law whilst being arrested like a criminal. Her bail conditions were, well, telling. She is never to use a mobile phone or a computer all the time she waits trial, which may be some considerable time, if it ever happens at all. Seems unlikely to me that Keir Starmer, the man who let Jimmy Savile go, the man who tried to deliver Julian Assange to the tender mercies of the United States of America, will win many trials in front of a jury. The rampage goes on in France. Pavel Durov released on bail, millions of euros of bail, travel restrictions, 2 calls at a police station per week for the crime of owning a platform that will not allow the French security services a back door into other people's information. considering that that would be a breach of the ethics on which the platform was built, a breach of the ethics which the users of Telegram signed up for in the first place. The owner of Rumble just made it out of Europe on time. France has banned the use of Rumble. Can you believe it? The European Union is considering similar measures against Elon Musk, the owner of the X platform, formerly known as Twitter, all because he is refusing to crack down on freedom of speech to the extent that Western governments demand. All the things that the Western world used to allege about other people's countries are now so standard, such a daily routine, that nobody even mentions them, not least because nobody ever reports them. If you're not on one of the dwindling number of social media platforms available to you in your country, then you won't even know about them. You may not know, for example, that Twitter has just been banned by the supposed leftist government of Lula in Brazil. The judge is going to charge you $10,000 per day if you are caught using a VPN to continue to use Twitter. Somebody came up with a wheeze. Sounds to me like quite a good one. If we all get a VPN and set it to Brazil, that's going to drive the authorities crazy. Sounds like a good idea to me. In Germany, the disastrous administration of little soldier Schulz, the little pink-faced social democrat, and Anna Baerbock, his bonkers green foreign minister, is now fast running out of time. The AfD, the German Nationalist Party, running on a platform of repairing relations with Russia, of ending mass immigration, of halting the deindustrialization of Germany, in part caused by the German collusion in the explosions that destroyed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The platform of the AfD is striking a chord with the poor German citizenry. That much is obvious when you've got a government that cares more about other countries, more about Ukraine, more about Israel than it does about Germany. You cannot be surprised if the German people fall out of love, insofar as they ever were, with Baerbock and with Schulz. But the breakthrough for the AfD this evening seems certain to be the first regional election victory forming a regional government in Germany since the Second World War. Lazy pundits call the AfD fascist, although the fascism that is clear and presently a danger to freedom in our lands is all coming from centrists and social democrats. After all, what does fascism mean other than stamping on the face of the people, denying the people the right to speak freely, to think freely, to act in support of their thoughts and their feelings? That is fascism, is it not? So it's the pot calling the kettle black. But the main reason why the AfD is on the march in Germany is the catastrophic economic situation in that country, coupled with, twinned ineluctably with, the absolute crackdown on free speech, free assembly, freedom of thought in Germany. If you don't incant the mantras of liberalism, greenery, quackery, and wokery, then you are ipso facto a fascist. The problem is that if the people begin to vote for the people you're calling fascist, in part because it's you who's behaving like the fascist, where does that all lead us? There's some groundbreaking testimony out tonight. I haven't yet read it and can't dwell on it, but it does, on the face of it, appear to be the case that my friend Melenchon was tricked, was fooled by Macron in the recent parliamentary elections. The so-called New Popular Front, led by Melenchon, made secret deals with Macron to stand their candidates down in key constituencies in the second round of voting, on the clear assumption that a government, including the New Popular Front, would be founded as a result. Not only did Macron renege on that deal, not only did Macron refuse to recognize the result of the election, this week he held talks with the far-right French nationalist leader, Marine Le Pen, with a view to finding a prime minister acceptable to her. You see, scratch a liberal, you'll always find a fascist. On the face of it, this greenery, quackery, wokery, it all seems so achingly, bone-achingly liberal and politically correct. But that's only a mask. When the time comes, liberals will always lean towards fascism rather than towards the politics of someone like me, or someone like Sarah Wagenknecht, the leader of the new party in Germany, which is espousing politics very similar to my own politics, but is proving rather more successful than my politics have turned out to be in Britain so far. Not that the politics of the Workers' Party are in any way dead. On Monday, I'll be putting the finishing touches to our brand new headquarters in the northwest region of England. We're fighting by-elections for council seats from as far apart as Lochee in Dundee, the parish in which I was born, and the Harrow Road constituency in London. If you support me, if you support my politics, then make your way to those election campaigns and make a difference. Politics is not, will never be only about tweets and statements on social media. In the end, elections have to be won, and they can only be won face to face, door to door, person to person. The situation in the Middle East catapults ever further towards disaster. Everyone knows what's happening in Gaza. Everyone with the vanishingly small number of social media platforms, that is. But not much attention is being paid to a new Holocaust underway in the West Bank, where millions of Palestinians live, under the supposed protection of international law, under the supposed supervision of the so-called international community. Land is being seized, buildings are being burned, families are being pogromed, murders are continuing apace. F-16 jets are bombing refugee camps, not in Gaza. That's a commonplace. But in the West Bank, the difference between the two being that whilst Hamas were in control of the Gaza Strip, there is no Hamas in the West Bank. Giving the lie, if it were necessary, any further to give the lie to the idea that this was about October 7th or that this was about Hamas. The Palestinians in the West Bank are not represented by Hamas. They did not break out of their concentration camp on the 7th of October last year. They did nothing to even remotely justify the pogroms that are taking place there now. The head of the Israeli intelligence office himself called it a pogrom. He himself said that the Israeli settlers were out of control, and the Israeli government's answer is to send thousands of their soldiers Never mind the ragamuffins of the settlements. Their most moral army, in their thousands, have invaded a territory they have controlled since 1967. And some fools say that there's no intention of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Well, there is. If they could, and they might, they would drive every last Palestinian from the historic land of Palestine, from Gaza into Egypt, where the diminutive tyrant Sisi claims that he will not accept them, to the kingdom of Jordan, where the diminutive tyrant says he will not accept them. Tyrants both, dwarves both, moral, political dwarves both, may very well find millions of Palestinians inside their domain by force by the time all of this has ended. And nobody is doing anything about it. We were told it was all about the hostages. But Israel is massacring its own hostages on a daily basis, murdering 5 of them only yesterday, and trying to blame it on the Palestinian captors. Nobody with any sense believes such guff. Why would the Palestinians murder 5 hostages that are worth more than their weight in gold in terms of a trade-off if and when any ceasefire negotiation ever comes to pass? The US officials quoted this evening say that Netanyahu is not really interested in a ceasefire, is not really interested in an exchange of hostages. Next, they'll be telling us that the Pope is a Catholic and that bears defecate in the woods. 100,000 people are on the streets of Tel Aviv this evening, demanding a ceasefire, demanding the release and exchange of hostages. There's a general strike in Israel tomorrow. Who knew that any trade unions continued to exist in Israel? But all of their members will be on a general strike tomorrow to try to bring down the Netanyahu government, or at least to force that Netanyahu government to parley, to exchange hostages. 3 times now I've talked about the exchange of hostages. Because while the world continues to obsess about the fate of a comparatively small number of Israeli hostages, many of whom have now been killed in the last 11th month of frenzied bombardment, several times the total bombardment of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nobody talks about the almost 10,000 Palestinian hostages held in Israeli dungeons without trial, without charge, seized entirely capriciously. One man who was released 3 days ago was re-arrested today, even though the shocking physical and mental state of the prisoners coming out of those dungeons, if and when they ever come out, is enough to turn your hair as white as the incarceration has turned theirs. 10,000 Palestinian hostages, and nobody gives a damn. My last word is on Keir Starmer. He carefully picked his candidates. Only the top-class candidates could make it through the sieve marked Sir Keir Starmer. He dismissed people on the eve of the election for tweets that they'd made or even liked 10 years before. Everybody was pristine except the honourable member for Ilford, who was revealed by the BBC, no less, to be a slum landlord, renting his tenants houses filled with mould and damp and ants and other vermin. Labour sticking by him. Lucy Powell, the so-called leader of the so-called House of Commons, backed him on television this very morning. A Labour Party whose top members of Parliament are not just landlords, but rogue landlords, foul landlords of the kind that Labour once upon a time pretended to despise and make political war against. The truth is, the country was never in love with Keir Starmer. Less than 20% of the population of Britain voted for him. He got a much smaller share of the vote, millions fewer votes, than his much maligned predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, whom he stabbed in the back to the point of political death. Keir Starmer was never loved, but he has rapidly become hated. His stealing of the cold weather allowance from Britain's old age pensioners, his keeping of the 2-child cap on child benefit, ritually denounced whilst in opposition, has consigned millions more children in Britain to poverty. 4 million children in Britain will go to bed hungry this evening in the 52nd day of a Labour government, which just said everything is going to get worse before it gets better. No wonder the likes of the AFD and the Front National in France prosper. When you see what the Liberals can do, why not go for the genuine article? Sadly, that is the conclusion that the voters in Germany have reached this evening. Fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy night. It's the mother of all talk shows. I defy anyone to contradict the point that I just made, that every person alive today was born of woman. So why would we say that the people in the labour wards, in the maternity units, are people who are giving birth? Why can't we say women? Why can't we say mothers? Why can't we say women who are breastfeeding, mothers who are breastfeeding? Why do we need to say people who are chest feeding? All of these words, and indeed all of the trend that you say you dissociate yourself from, of transgenderism, transmania, I call it, are all taking rights away from women.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
As always, we're running a poll. Is fascism coming in the West? Yes or no? A big poll. 24,330 of you have voted already, and I'm only announcing the poll now. The answers are yes or no, and you can vote on my Telegram, t.me/George Galloway. Please follow me on Telegram. That's t.me/George Galloway. You can vote on my Twitter, my X, and follow me there too if you have not already. You can vote on the YouTube community poll, and you can vote on the YouTube stream. If you're watching on the YouTube stream or on Facebook or on any platform that allows you to share this output, please share it with all your friends and contacts. Don't forget to like the show on YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to call the show, it's toll free in the United States and Canada, +1 844 944 3344. It's free of charge in the UK and Ireland, 08 08196 5522, and the worldwide number for those of you outside of those areas, it's 0044203966 2625. Coming up in the second hour of the show is the legend that is Max Keiser. I promise you, you won't want to miss it. But first, Shereen Malherbe, Palestinian novelist and children's author, is one of those who've got family members amongst the hostages seized in the West Bank. And we wanted to talk to her about those. Shereen, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. It must add insult to injury that nobody even talks about the Holocaust on the West Bank. Everyone, at least on social media, is fixated on Gaza, where the events are truly unprecedented. But much more quietly, Israel is basically committing the same kind of crimes on the West Bank, where Hamas doesn't exist, where their own, I was going to call him a puppet, let me be kinder, their own allied president is supposedly in control, Mahmoud Abbas, yet Israel is running rampage in the territory. Tell us what you hear from your family.
Okay, hi George, thanks for having me back. The reason that I wanted to come on as well and talk to you is because the situation has just become unbearable. That's their words that are coming out now from my family in the West Bank. So just to be clear, we're talking about areas outside of Gaza, and also I do have family in East Jerusalem as well. And they have literally said, we are dying without people watching. And the situation has just, as you said, it's a rampage. And if you visit, some of my family did visit over the summer, you'll see how different the place is. One of my uncle's houses, there are no young men left in the house. He has three sons, and one by one, they have been kidnapped by the occupation in raids. And this is in Jericho in the West Bank. One of them was shot in the leg. They don't know where they are. They have literally disappeared. They are not receiving medical treatment. No one knows where they are. And this has, they have ramped this up massively since October the 7th, but definitely over the last few months. I think the total that one of my journalist members of the family told me was we're over 10,000 detained, as you said earlier. And he said the last count that they had, it was nearly 300 children who are also under 16 years old. So, I've been trying to sort of raise awareness, saying what can we do collectively to tell people about this. I contacted Cage, and they said, just try and tell as many people as possible and highlight the plight of the Palestinian prisoners. We've had, as you said, prisoners coming out. They are literally unrecognizable from the state that they've been treated in. They are seeing people and saying, I did not even know it was that person because they look so different. And I did try and want to get sort of names and speak to people, but they have been told not to speak to the media or anybody about anything that happens. As you said earlier as well, they're rearrested and they're put back in these jails where no one knows where they are, what's happening to them. And then when we do hear reports coming out, it's utter savagery. So you have the prisoner situation, and then you also have the blockades throughout the West Bank. So just for the listeners who aren't aware, the villages in Palestine are separated from one another. They're separated through blockades that the occupation put up, whether these be metal security gates, armed, or whether they're just huge concrete roadblocks. You cannot get out of your village if they decide to close it off. And that's what they're doing now. They're closing off all the West Bank villages from one another, barricading them off from one another, completely freezing water and electricity, stopping people from traveling, getting in or out. And they're actually doing one of the biggest land grabs that we've ever seen whilst they're doing this. So they are building settlements between these villages to further break up the West Bank. And this is everywhere. This is including Jerusalem. This is Jericho. This is the north, as far north as Jenin. And even in Jenin, they've destroyed about 75%, I read just before I came online, of their roads. They're just bulldozing them up so people can't get out.
Yes, so they are raping prisoners, anally raping prisoners with objects. They've been caught red-handed on camera doing that, and were not prosecuted, were arrested and then freed, and it is now officially permissible for guards to anally rape Palestinian prisoners, even unto the point of death. In fact, one of the rapists is now a regular on the Sofa TV chat shows on the mainstream Israeli media. He had a balaclava on the first time, but he took it off when he realized that he was something of a personality. So they are seizing more and more land illegally. They are starving the population, dividing them from each other, digging up roads, dive bombing refugee camps. Balata was dive bombed by F-16s just yesterday. The number of people being killed and wounded is exponentially rising. And again, I make the point, adding insult to injury, nobody even talks about it. It must be particularly hard for someone like you with family there.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the unbalance. Like you said, at first, the Israeli occupier covered his face, and then he just doesn't need to, because what's happening is they are acting with the full backing of of the West. There is no consequence whatsoever. There has not been a consequence for their actions, so they're emboldened. They're doing as much as they possibly can before, just as much as they possibly can. Nothing seems to be enough. Nothing is depraved enough. And don't forget this: how they treat Palestinian prisoners, how they treat Palestinians. This is policy. This is not, oh, it was a one-off. Whatever they want to say to try and rescue some PR, which, to be honest, is completely shot now. This is policy, always has been. There has never been there's been sort of a cover-up to make them appear, as you said, the most moral army in the world, to be this democracy. But it's now being exposed for what it is, and that is a brutal, genocidal regime. And that will continue unless someone puts a stop to it, because they're not going to stop it themselves.
Well, I'm so old, I remember the International Court of Justice ordering them to cease and desist. Oh, it must have been 6 months ago, finding them guilty of a myriad of war crimes, crimes against humanity. I'm so old, I remember the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announcing that he was applying for arrest warrants on Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. I'm so old I remember these things, but not many people will, because absolutely nothing happened as a result.
And nothing happens because you have a media which does not report. We have platforms like yours. There is platforms on social media. Even my book launch was censored. I mean, that's what we're talking about now. It's very hard to speak. We saw Richard Medhurst being arrested for his independent journalism. There's a huge crackdown on it. So it becomes very frustrating. And I think that's why the family member I was speaking to said, we are dying without anyone watching. He's actually been a journalist throughout Palestine his whole life. And he's, before I was even born. And I said, how are you covering it now? And he said, we just can't, because you are literally a target. I mean, children are targets. And I don't understand how half the world can look away and continue. So, we do have action that people are doing, but it just doesn't feel like it's enough. And, everyone's condemning, but there's no action. And it seems as though, normal life is continuing. for everybody else. And it just makes you feel as though, should it be continuing in this normal way while something so horrendous is happening, literally why everybody is watching, at least for the part in Gaza. And I think this is what is making it so unbearable for the Palestinians living there, is to know that everybody knows about this, and yet there's absolute silence from anybody that could actually do anything about it.
Well, let's go through who they are. And this is an important lesson that people have to learn. The British government, which is up to its neck in Palestinian blood, is a Labour government. The French government, up to its neck in Palestinian blood, is a Labour Blairite government in the form of Macron. The German government is literally up to its neck in blood, led by Labour, the SPD, and the Green Party. The United States, over its neck, up to its eyeballs in Palestinian blood, is the Democratic Party, the Labour equivalent in the United States. These are all centre-left governments, all of them committing these crimes against your people. It's pretty hard to bear, isn't it?
I mean, it's literally, for the people there, it's unbearable. For us watching in the diaspora and around the world, and, the allies of Palestine. And it's reached a stage where I write for a living, and there's almost barely no words left. So, what we've reached is this stage where we have it being filmed. We know the figures coming out. We know all of this is happening. We keep being told 40,000, 50,000 people murdered, 10,000 in prison. And they're saying, the problem with the numbers is that it's sort of adding to that dehumanization of Palestinians. So it's just making it another number, 10,000, 20,000. It's not making a difference. So I'm saying to my family, what would you say to everybody on the platform I'm going on today with you? And he said, tell them to put themselves in our shoes and imagine that they are at home at night, even if they have a home left, because they're all being literally stolen from under their feet, with your children asleep in bed, and there is a raid at your door, and you have a full army coming to drag your children out of bed to take them to these god-awful places in the middle of the desert where you don't know what's happened to them. And he said, as much as we need the figures, and we absolutely need the figures, what we also need is to imagine that we are in that situation. There shouldn't be any difference that it's them and not us. This is where we are now, where there's a separation almost. Oh, it's happening in the Middle East and it's to Palestinians, so it's not really anything to do with me. But it is. This is a huge human rights violation. This is a huge violation of what humanity is supposed to be. And the world is not going to forget this. So, I would say what's coming out is this: really try and understand what they are going through, so that it, takes us out of this position, so that we act and do something about it.
Well, empathy is in short supply amongst the powerful and their scribes in the national and international media. But Shereen Malherbe, you are on the right side, and may God bless your pen. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. We'll go straight to calls now, but first I want to plug the podcast, because we are #1 in Malaysia this week. That's our first time as #1 in Malaysia. We're in the top 10 in Russia again this week. You can download the MOATS podcast, the quintessential Mother of All Talk Shows, by scanning the QR code on your screen now. Let me take a quick break, then it's your calls all the way to the hour, and then it's the legendary Max Keiser. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story, in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down, the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You've been thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, you know, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that at least.
You've got that on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before it was published, but actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
Now you get that film, Killing Kelly, and our previous film, The Killings of Tony Blair, absolutely free of charge if you support us on Patreon. Patreon.com/George Galloway. It will cost you the price of a cup of tea per week in an insalubrious cafe. So if you think MOATS is worth it, then support it. The fastest, easiest way that you can support this show twice a week is by going on to patreon.com/George Galloway and get those two great films, if I say so myself, and some really spectacular new content. I have just recorded a short history of Yasser Arafat. It's quite explosive, if I say so myself, and it will be available on Patreon very soon. It's in a very limited form of post-production right now. Is fascism coming in the West? Yes or no? Simple question. About 90% of the respondents, I'm afraid to say, think the answer is yes. But have your say. 25,000 people have now voted. First up is a legend in New York. It's Erobos. Welcome, Erobos.
Salubrious late evening to you, Mr. Galloway, and greetings and salutations to the MOATS audience and the upping numbers, the more people climbing on the international MOATS bandwagon, and more power to all of them. A sobering monologue, as always, but it seemed to be getting more and more stringent and upbraiding psychologically. Wow. I've read as far as the poll goes, I've read and a great guess too, by the way, I didn't want to overlook that. I've read the 3 foundational documents on fascism quite a while back. They're not a long read. They're not like volumes and volumes. They're pretty short, relatively short documents. And it occurred to me when I read this article based on a study, a political science study, conducted by Northwestern University and the other one that's over here. It'll come to me. So the question was asked in 2014 if America is an oligarchy or a democracy. And in about 40 years of research going back, Princeton University in Northwestern universities. And the question was asked, at the risk of being redundant, is America an oligarchy? And over 40 to 50 years of data, what they conclusively show is that what 90% or 95% of the people vote for, they never get. However, the ruling class, the wealth parasites, the zombie bankers and hedge fund hyenas, 95%, they always get what they want. And they don't vote, right? They don't have to. They control the political class, they control the economics. And in effect, that's the preeminent clue or novel revelation of fascism. It is the unity, the marriage, as Mussolini would have said, between the corporation and state. Now, the nationalists and the revanchists, the racism, and all the violence associated with that, that's for mass control and mass distraction, which is quite effective. The white supremacy or the Galician supremacy or whatever it is. So those two things are fully in place, and they have been here all this time. They may call it something different. Like you mentioned, the fascists are not wearing lapels, uniforms. They're coming in power suits. They're basically people of color, black people, brown people, who are practicing white supremacy, keeping the wars going, no health care, homeless all over the place. My response to the poll is that it's not that it's coming, it's already firmly planted in place. And without a workers' party and without the restructured People's Party, a Green Party, it's gonna completely just smoothen the brains of the collective masses, and we're gonna be sleepwalking, like lemmings off the abyss in the Arctic into the depths. And I don't know if it's too late for that, but if this continues, we're not getting out of it, not for a long night. And that's my perspective, and I'm always thankful. And
well, it might be too late. We must hope that it's not, but it might be too late, especially if, as you say, it's already firmly planted. I'm not quite so pessimistic as that. I believe that it's coming if we don't stop it, and that we need to find unity to stop it. We need to find unity across class, across political and ideological barriers. All those who believe in freedom of speech and the right of people freely to think and express themselves must now come together, or freedom of speech will be no more. And without freedom of speech, you can have no freedom at all. It's not for nothing that it's the First Amendment in your Constitution, because without it, no other amendment has any meaning. If you can't speak freely, you can't have free elections. If you can't speak freely, you cannot make informed political choices. Therefore, nothing and nobody has a democratic mandate. Therefore, everything that our political class do is illegitimate. And where it's illegitimate, people have a duty to disobey illegitimate laws and illegitimate demands of illegitimately elected people. Illegitimate because the freedom of speech that would have given them legitimacy when the elections came no longer exists. And this is only to take one strand of it. And I made the joke earlier that we should all get a VPN and switch it to Brazil to confound the idiot decision to ban X in Brazil because of a dispute between the plutocrat who owns X and the Attorney General of the Brazilian government. But Sarah Wilkinson, for example, the 61-year-old lady that was arrested in Britain this week and who's been bailed on the terms of never using a mobile telephone or a computer. I mean, Who can accept bail conditions like that? And as I made the point at the time, the police have to be rather cautious about this, because if they're going to go around arresting perfectly peaceful, respectable old ladies, forgive me, Sarah, for supporting international law, then they may have in the end to arrest all of us. And that would be millions of us. And that would make the law an ass. That would make the law and the people who govern it in Parliament, it would make them an ass too. It would mean that they lost their legitimacy. This is very thin ice on which our authorities are skating. I'm just saying. Thanks, Erobas. You can't handle the truth, says fascism has been in the West for quite a long time, if one pays attention. You can see all the symbolism of fascism in the US Congress wall alone every day. The definition of fascism is corporatism. And Jack Klugman, great name, says you can bet this is a Zio fool press. Ritter, Klarenberg, Medhurst, Wilkinson, et al. You are next. Lavender, all AI lists are next. Knock, knock. Jack thinks I am next. Well, am I, officer? Surely not. I promise you a hell of a blowback if you try that. Olive Roots says, I wanted to answer no to the poll, but only because fascism is already here. And the Nazis never went away, only rebranded. Duncan is in my hometown of Dundee. He wants to talk about the US and Israel. Go ahead, Duncan.
Evening, George. Great show. Well done, your wife, yourself, and your staff. I'd like to ask you a question or get your thoughts on a visit Britain had last week from a Mr. Robert O'Brien. You may not be familiar with him, but he was a senior defense official or foreign policy defense official in the Trump administration and has stayed close to Mr. Trump. And he looks like he may be, if Trump does get in, he may be back in his old position. And he was dispatched over to Britain last week to give a speech at a political think tank, where he said that if Britain put an embargo on weapons to Israel, they would be kicked out the F-35 fighter program, which Britain was an initial investor in, and actually operate F-35s now, so I assume they're not going to supply maintenance. They would also be subject to counter-embargo and sanctions if they did indeed cut Israel off. And not just that Britain, by withdrawing their objection to Bibi's arrest warrant, they've kind of angered the powers that be in Washington, and they need to reinstate the objection to Netanyahu being arrested. And when you read the speech and you see what he's doing, he can only have been dispatched here by AIPAC. I mean, it's actually shocking just how it's like London is now Israeli occupied territory. Can you give me any thoughts on that, George?
Well, powerful, Duncan. Not much to add to it. I said on the Wednesday show that AIPAC had suddenly announced they had spent more than $100 million on US election campaigns this year, and it's only August. We've got the Congress, the Senate, and the presidential elections, gubernatorial elections, all to come. $100 million by a foreign power has been spent in the US democratic system. Virtually every single congressperson in America is bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. They're not Jews, by the way. Most of them are Christians. Most of them are evangelical Christians. It's an important distinction to make that. But the Israel lobby owns and controls the voting and political decisions of the vast majority of members of the US Congress. This in an era where Russian interference in American elections, Chinese interference, Iranian interference is all routinely alleged and manufactured. So the United States political process is entirely in alignment with Netanyahu, entirely. Even when 100,000 people are on the streets of Tel Aviv, even when Netanyahu is hated by the clear majority of the Israeli public, they're still very much in love with him in Washington, in the White House, and in the Congress. And there would appear to be, from what you say, no change likely if and when Donald Trump wins. If Trump lives up to these kind of blood-curdling promises, personally, I'd be very happy not to be in the F-35 club. I'd be very happy if we didn't get any more spare parts for the F-35s we've already got. I'd be very happy if we were kicked out of the Five Eyes, very happy if we were kicked out of NATO. Hallelujah, bring it on, Donny. Kick us out of the lot and get to hell out of our country. We don't want you here. You will not pick our governments. You will not pick our policies. You will not tell us what we have to do. Sam in Montreal on Iran is up next. Go ahead, Sam.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. Go ahead.
Yes, I actually tried to call a couple of weeks ago with this comment when you were talking about the U.S. as Israel's big brother, and you said Iran has its big brothers, Russia and China. And I wanted to make the comment because you kept asking, or wondering rather, about the delay in Iran's response. And I believe Iran's reluctance is due to an understanding of history. All of this is rooted in October 7th. Another date that not a lot of people are bringing up in this context is October 6th, 1973. At that time, Egypt was aligned with Russia, and when they proceeded into occupied Palestine or Israel, the Russians were reluctant to support a more forceful attack. And there was a great deal of discord between the Russians and Sadat, and he claims, in any case, that that was the reason for his the fraying relations with Russia and the rapprochement with the U.S. afterwards. So it's entirely possible, and there is some history to this, whereas the U.S. has sent its aircraft carriers, nuclear subs, given them the latest F-35 jets to Israel. Russia has been very reluctant to provide the same kind of support to Iran. I mean, they've been dragging their feet for several years. No, that's simply not true.
I'm gonna stop you there because you're piling one untruth upon another. It's true that Sadat said that, but as another harlot, Mandy Rice Davis, famously said in the doc, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He had to find an excuse for betraying the Arab cause, betraying the Palestinian cause, concluding the Camp David agreement, breaking the relationship with Russia that had been with the Soviet Union at that time, which had been very close. It was a lie. The Soviet Union had no reluctance whatsoever for Egypt to recover its stolen property in the Sinai, the West Bank of the Suez Canal. The war aims of the Arab coalition in the October War in 1973 were wholly supported by the Soviet Union, and indeed were entirely armed by the Soviet Union. So it's entirely untrue, that one. As is the claim that Russia is being reluctant to give Iran the wherewithal to meet its defense needs. That's not true either. The S-400 air defense system is now not just given, but installed and ready to fire all around the key strategic sites in Iran. Russia is standing firm behind Iran. I'm not blaming Iran for not doing what it said it would do. I'm blaming Iran for saying what it would do if it was not going to do it. I followed the policy of walking softly, but carrying a big stick. And I believe that Iran has a big stick, and it will have its own reasons for not using it. I don't blame them for that, but just stop saying you're going to use it when you're not. Now, my other show, Have It Out with Galloway, is attracting a weird and wonderful clientele. I don't mean the audience, that's composed entirely of the enlightened. But because you get an opportunity to appear on the screen with me in it, every fanatic, fascistic, racist creep in the world is turning up on my show. So I need you to provide some balance. I don't mind. Look, I just get my short sword out and slay them, sometimes wittily. I hope you'll agree. Look at the last one to see evidence in that regard. I don't mind if everybody on the video wall is attacking me. I don't mind if every one of them is a kook. But it is a bit unrepresentative, so you need to come on the show. There's hundreds of you every night trying to get through on the phone. Why not try and get through in person with your face on the wall? Let's have a more intimate exchange. Take a look. If you want to join me on Have It Out with Galloway, you can be the audience member on that video wall so that I can see as well as hear you. Come and have it out with Galloway. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. www.haveitoutwithgalloway.com.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
The legendary Max Keiser and I were once colleagues and friends. He's gone away to Latin America and drifted somewhat politically also. We were never comrades, but we were friends. And I am one of his biggest admirers, not least because he advised me when the price was very, 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 very low to get into Bitcoin. Nowadays, Max Keiser is not just a presenter and a filmmaker. He is the chief advisor on Bitcoin to the president of El Salvador. Let's hear what he gets up to in that regard and in others. Max Keiser, how wonderful to see you again after a brief couple of year interlude. Tell us how you ended up in El Salvador and what you do there.
Yeah, George, great to see you. And let me bring you up to date on what Max and Stacy have been doing. We visited El Salvador at the end of 2021 after the president made Bitcoin legal tender. We sat down with him for a few hours, and by the end of that meeting, he convinced us to move to El Salvador and give some advice on the best way to roll out Bitcoin policy and how to build more Bitcoin into the economy. And that's what we've been doing now for 2.5 years. And it's going really well. El Salvador has really become the shining city on a hill. It's the new Camelot. It's, I always say, the new Statue of Liberty is the volcano in El Salvador. It's leading the world with economic freedom. We're making a move now for press freedom. And I think that if people remember the way the United States used to be, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, where the emphasis was on freedom, they should consider moving to El Salvador. This is really the heartbeat of freedom in the world today.
I'm more likely to move to Russia than El Salvador, but I can see how it attracted you, because you've always been an advocate of Bitcoin, which many of the viewers will not actually understand. I'll be honest with you, Max. Even I, who took your advice, didn't quite know why I was taking it, except it was coming from you, and you're the expert. Tell us, what are El Salvador's Bitcoin policies and why they matter, what they do for other people, how many potatoes they put on people's plates?
Sure. Well, Bitcoin is becoming a huge factor in the election all over the world. And in the United States, all of the parties have put out a statement on Bitcoin. RFK Jr. is now what we say orange pilled. He's a full Bitcoin maximalist. Donald Trump came to the Bitcoin conference in Nashville, had a huge presentation about Bitcoin. The Democrats were anti-Bitcoin. Now they're pro-Bitcoin because Bitcoin is offering something in the world today that is desperately needed in the realm of money. Bitcoin is uncensorable, so you can't stop anyone from transacting in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is unconfiscatable, so you can't take anyone's Bitcoin from them. And Bitcoin is inflation-proof, so no matter how much money the central banks print, it just means that the purchasing power of Bitcoin keeps going higher and higher. In El Salvador, the president recognized all of these attributes of Bitcoin a few years ago, made Bitcoin legal tender, and now the country's economy is booming. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And with Bitcoin and the introduction of what will soon be a Bitcoin bank and other attributes of Bitcoin, the country has the possibility to become completely debt-free. So that means no interest on debt. That contributes to the GDP growth. So it has a remarkable list of benefits to the people of El Salvador. There's a lot of jobs that come with Bitcoin in the Bitcoin industry. A lot of Bitcoin companies and big Bitcoin companies are now moving to El Salvador, and they're creating lots of jobs. And like I said about this interesting attribute of Bitcoin that it's unconfiscatable is that for the first time in history, people who work for a living have a way to put that money that they earn away in something that's inflation-proof, unconfiscatable, and they can transact with anyone else without fear of any censorship. You know, you mentioned Iran a few moments ago. They were, of course, shut off from the SWIFT system a few years ago. They're now turning to Bitcoin to be able to transact without that risk. Talk about Russia. Russia had $600 billion seized from U.S. authorities. They're now turning to Bitcoin because it's unconfiscatable. So it's really remarkably changing the face of the global economy. I'm not sure why you would prefer Russia over El Salvador. I think, George, if you were to come and pay us a visit, you would open your eyes to what's happening here and maybe have a slightly different opinion, my friend.
I've been in El Salvador, but in darker times than the ones you described now. Tell me about the White House. Are they taking a hostile attitude to Bitcoin because Trump is warming to it and because RFK is something of a zealot in it? In which case, if Trump wins, do we see a big shift to Bitcoin in the United States? And what will that mean?
Well, all governments, it seems to me, and I think this would not be far from your thoughts as well, seem to be drifting toward authoritarianism. Certainly in the UK, there seems to be a drift toward authoritarianism. In the United States, there's a drift toward authoritarianism. And the Bitcoin is really the opposite of authoritarianism because it's perfectly decentralized. There's nobody who controls it. There's nobody at the center of it. And so it's the solution to an authoritarian regimes. And what's happening is that, you know, I always say, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you, because it's a constant in a world of constant change. And so in the US, with Donald Trump has embraced Bitcoin because a lot of the funding is now coming from the Bitcoin lobbyists, you know, in the U.S. who, you know, when I told you to buy Bitcoin at $10, George, there are many people who bought Bitcoin at $10. It's now at $60,000 plus. So a lot of people have made hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. They're sitting there on their Bitcoin and they want a better world. So they're trying to get politicians to understand the ethos of Bitcoin, to understand why it's the best form of money ever created in the history of the world, and for a better world. Because when you have money that's inflation-proof, unconfiscatable, and uncensorable, you eliminate the problems of having a fiat bank where they print money constantly to debase the purchasing power of the consumers on the other end of the money printing. And they also take away the government's ability to, remember Julian Assange, when he was trying to raise money when he was being held in the Ecuadorian embassy, all the major credit card companies and PayPal shut him down. The only money that got to Julian Assange was through Bitcoin. I mean, that right there should have been a turning point in people's consciousness about the value of Bitcoin and free press. The free press, without a free press, you have really nothing, George. And Bitcoin allows free press to thrive in ways that you can't find in any other fiat money or payment rail system that are easily interrupted or censored by those who do not want free press, George.
Well, you advocate for it very eloquently, I must say. But what are the downsides? I mean, I can think of one obvious one. There are not a few charlatans in the business. I'm thinking of the guy who just went to prison, the big Democrat in the United States. Young man, filthy rich, billionaire, funding all these Democratic candidates and causes. But his whole thing went bust. What are the things to avoid is what I'm asking.
Right. Well, in the case of Sam Bankman-Fried, who had a company called FTX, they sold basically what are called altcoins, or I don't know what the policy is for cursing on your show, but euphemistically we call these shitcoins. These are centralized, censorable venture capital projects that are what we say orange washed. They come across and say, oh, we're like Bitcoin, but they're actually just trashy, centralized tokens, and they are gambling instruments essentially. So you can't make the comparison between anything Sam Bankman-Fried was doing and these altcoin markets and Bitcoin. Bitcoin stands alone as the only of these cryptos that is perfectly decentralized and unconfiscatable. None of the others stand up to that test, but people are gullible. And it doesn't, just because you're talking about Bitcoin doesn't mean you get rid of gullible people. There are people every day that fall for scams, many scams, all types of scams, gambling scams. You get all kinds of things going on constantly. It doesn't speak to the viability of Bitcoin itself. It's like, people sell fake gold. You know, you can buy up and say, oh, buy my gold. It turns out that it's just tungsten. It's not gold, right? It's fake gold. But that doesn't mean that gold is no longer a viable money or medium of exchange. Gold is still gold. The fact that people try to sell fake gold and get caught up in scams involved in gold, that doesn't change gold. Same thing with Bitcoin. People get caught up in scams because they're being sold something that they're told is Bitcoin or similar to Bitcoin. It's a scam and they get hurt, but it doesn't change Bitcoin. Bitcoin has not proven itself to be really perfect money in every sense of the world. And this is having a profound effect in El Salvador, where the economy is growing. There's a sense of hope. People are, for the first time, able to save and with money that is unconfiscatable. And we're having a fantastic impact in El Salvador, and we're seeing that play out right now.
You mentioned gold. Warren Buffett seems to be dumping stock at quite a rate. He's moving presumably into other things. I presume that gold, silver, maybe even Bitcoin, or just cash is what he's up to. What would be his reasoning behind that?
Well, Warren Buffett is dumping a lot of stocks. He's dumping his Apple stock and his Bank of America stock, and he's putting it into cash. He's got over $300 billion in cash in his investment vehicle of Berkshire Hathaway. And if you study Warren Buffett, as I've done for decades, he looks at certain valuation metrics that would determine whether the market as a whole is overvalued and whether there are any bargains on offer. You know, the price of a stock, I learned when I was a stockbroker in New York many years ago, half of the price of a stock is determined by the overall market direction. Another quarter of the valuation is determined by the sector that that particular company is in. And then only 25% of a stock's direction is determined by the individual stock itself, because it's a market of stocks. And what Warren Buffett is obviously telegraphing to the investment community is that the market at this juncture in history is overvalued, and he's raising cash. He's raising his war chest so that when you have the correction, when you have and I think we're in for a major correction, he'll have dry powder. He'll be able to go in there and buy stocks on the cheap, he's very famous for doing that. So I think it's very typical of what Warren has done and what he says. And if you listen to what he's been saying for years now, this should be no shock in terms of he believes, based on what his actions are, that this market is at very highly overvalued.
Well, you mentioned correction. Others predict a crash. How big a correction? How big a crash might we be in for? And when do you think it's going to happen?
I think in February of 2022, when the Ukraine-Russia conflict began, it's the end of an era of globalization, and we entered into an era of deglobalization and de-dollarization. And that process has now taken a few years, but the world is de-dollarizing. The BRICS are moving away from the dollar. The dollar is not being used as world reserve currency for the reasons we just gave. Because the U.S. has weaponized the dollar. They would shut Iran off SWIFT, or they'll seize dollars from Russia. So these BRICS countries have decided to create their own inter-country currency payments and their own currency, which they'll get more details on that pretty quickly. So you're entering into a de-dollarization, which means ultimately, when you start to extrapolate what that means, is that America is a country with approximately $32-33 trillion in debt, and that debt rolls every day. It has to be refinanced every day, and most of the money that comes to refinance America's debt comes from outside of America. So at some point, if China, Japan, or others say, you know what, we're not going to buy America's debt anymore because we have an alternative. We have this other currency, which is over at the BRICS, or of course we have Bitcoin, which Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank characterized as an escape hatch, which is absolutely true because you're escaping the fiat money world. That can very quickly turn into a selling rout where there's no buyers, there's no bid, there's nobody who wants the U.S. Treasury bonds. And that historically, when you have a debt spiral is what it's called, when it starts to kick in, it happens very, very quickly. And I think we're at the end game. I think you bring up Warren Buffett, and I think you're spot on. I mean, that should tell people in the finance world the most successful investor in history is getting out of stocks because he thinks that things are at a tipping point. And part of that tipping point would be, as you point out, a correction. You know, these markets have been through 50% corrections fairly frequently over the past 40 or 50 years. You know, I lived through the 1987 correction. It was quite vicious. We had the 2008 crisis. I would put it this way, George. I would characterize the current market sentiment and conditions as kind of part two of the global financial crisis of 2008. If you recall, the world had a credit freeze. We went into a massive downturn, and the central banks had to get together and print a fresh, they called it $800 billion to bail out the banks, but it turned out to be closer to 16 or 17 trillion. But instead of fixing the problem, they simply expanded the credit limits of the banks that caused the problem to begin with. They gave them 10 times more credit facilities. So what did the banks do? They simply did the exact same thing that they were doing that caused the problem, but they did it on a scale that was 10 times bigger. So now we're in 2024, and the exact same thing is repeating, but it's 10 times bigger. So I think that this crash, this global crash that we're seeing is kind of unfolding, would be bigger than the 2008 crash. And the 2008 crash brought the world to the precipice of a global financial catastrophe. So I think we're on the doorstep of something bigger.
Nobody talks economics like you, Max, and many people miss your frequent broadcasts in the in the past on RT when we were all there. How do people follow you nowadays?
Well, you can most easily follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is simply, or X as it's called now, Max Keiser, and that's generally the easiest place to find me. And I direct traffic into our various enterprises and things that are happening from my X account of Max Keiser. I should mention that although you were not necessarily very aggressive buying Bitcoin at that time, Gayatri, as I understand it, has a huge Bitcoin position, George. So you should speak to your wife about this, because apparently she's sitting on a vast fortune she hasn't told you about.
No, she's told me. She doesn't need to tell me. We have no secrets. Well, Max, it has been a delight as well as an education. Please give my love to your missus, and we hope in person to meet again, either in El Salvador or elsewhere. Thanks for joining us, Max Keiser. I told you he was a legend, and he just proved it all over again. OK Fernandez says, Dear Max and Stacey, could you tell us what will happen to the dollar? I think he just did. Pinky says, it sounds great, but what about the supercomputers that are almost here that can crack the mathematical computations used in Bitcoin? If you're listening, what then, Max? Now, apparently the president of El Salvador is of Palestinian extraction. I just learned. Thank you for that, Pinky. Let me take a quick break. Then it's your calls all the way to my Bitcoin rich wife, Mrs. Galloway. You don't want to miss that. Stay tuned.
Many people today struggle with the common mainstream media consumer. These types of people are mindless zombies. Instead of living authentically, they feed off masking their true thoughts and feelings, doing nothing and criticizing those who actually do their research. This type of media consumer can be highly manipulative, so here are some golden standard clapbacks when they start with their propaganda. When they say you are too much for them, show them a mirror and tell them to look for less. Draw a diagram of where your business is and their business is to visually show them they are in the wrong area. When they say, please watch this clip from this reputable BBC journalist, remind them that there are no longer any reputable BBC journalists, and to instead watch the mother of all talk shows for some real journalism. The next time you encounter a brainwashed zombie, hold your head high and know their obsession to eat your brain is masking their jealousy of your confidence, your freedom in self-expression, and most importantly, your authenticity. Keep listening to learn more on the mother of all talk shows.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Is fascism coming in the West? Answer yes or no. 27,597 of you have voted. And by quite a margin, I mean roughly 90% of you say yes, which is a very concerning phenomenon indeed. You've still got about 15, 20 minutes to get your vote in. Let's try and get that over 30,000, shall we? On line one is Donna in Panama on censorship. I told you, it's the Global University of the Airwaves. Donna in Panama, welcome.
Oh, thank you, George, and my best to you and Gayatri and your children and grandchildren.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Two questions. One, are there any limits that you would put on speech? I mean, when you're speaking about censorship, is there any limit you'd put on it? Number one. Number two, I was, if you will, converted to my current pro-Palestinian stance by two British chaps St. Cat's Oxford grads online on Facebook. And they did such a good job that I have become a real zealot, a real activist. And I've tried to do something similar with friends of mine and even, strangers that I meet on social media. And unfortunately, I've not been able to move the needle even one little tiny bit on this issue. And as a result, the brainwashing is so strong in the United States. I was just wondering if you think there's some technique that I can use to get through to people.
Oh, Donna, I almost sang that to you because that song's going through my mind right now. Wonderful, wonderful song. Oh, Donna, you are one of the most eloquent of our callers. And I look forward to your calls from Panama. And if you can't move the needle, then that is depressing indeed, because you're just the sort of person with just the sort of skill set that is required. Everyone's converted by someone. I've written about this in my book. I'm not the only one. I was alone in the Labour office in Dundee in the mid-1970s. I was alone. I was printing. I was up to my elbows in printer's ink. I wasn't going to answer the door, but I did, and it was a life-changing thing. A man called Saad Jabaji said he was from the local university Palestinian Students' Union, and he wanted to come in and speak to the leaders about Palestine. I said, well, the leaders are not here, but I'm here, and the rest is history. After an hour or 2 hours listening to him, I was a fully signed up supporter of the Palestinian revolution. So everyone has these moments of epiphany, and mine has lasted all of my life. I was 21 when he came through that door, and now I'm not 21 anymore, but I'm still here standing in the same place, and I can do no other, as I think you'll find you can do no other now that you have seen the light. But you're right, it's our job to be the epiphany in other people's lives, to be the person that moves the needle. And all I can do at this this hour is to urge persistence. Never give up. You know, it's easy to give up. It's easy to switch off. It's easy to say, I can't take any more of this. I'm going to retreat into private spheres. I don't want to see any more decapitated children, limbless children, amputee. I can't bear it anymore. That's easy, but you must resist it. It would be a real betrayal to do that, because although you cannot materially help these people, by being witness to what's happening to them, you are not only doing something, but you, from your own point of view, will be able to claim the credit for that on the final day, which I believe will come for all of us. I'll tell you what Gayatri and I are working on, something called a Speakers Academy. I'm going to set up an online Speakers Academy in which virtually I will give my experience of my abilities, such as they are, and guidance to other people on what's the word, an interactive basis. So I'll tell you, you tell me back. I'll ask you questions, you ask me questions. We're going to do that. It will be later in the year, but look out for it. George Galloway's Speakers Academy. And now that I've announced it, anyone who already supports me on Patreon right now, this minute, this hour, will of course have free admission to the Speakers Academy. Anyone who comes after this hour will have to pay the same fee as everyone else. And the fee will be modest, and it will be very good value for money, I believe. So thanks, Donna. Richard is in Plymouth with a question about nuclear war. Go ahead, Richard. Richard, are you there? That's a pity, because I did want to have... Richard, are you there? We'll come back to you. Aquila McCann says, Europe is falling into the abyss. It is decaying and rotting due to the rise of ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism. No other country's opinions matter. And Suzanne Barral says, is fascism coming to the West? Oh my God, with a vengeance, and especially towards honest, hard-working journalists. Lately, Richard Medhurst, Craig Murray, Scott Ritter, and several more. Do all things with love says, but is it true that Bukele is a pro-Israel Palestinian? That makes me very cautious about all of this Bitcoin stuff. I have no idea about his views on Israel-Palestine. I know that in Latin America, there are millions of Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and others who are deeply concerned about the Palestinian cause. Richard in Plymouth is back on nuclear war. Go ahead, Rich.
Hello, George. Nice to speak to you. Good evening. Hopes all is well, and I love your show. I think it's brilliant.
Thank you.
Now, my question is, are we going to find ourselves in a nuclear conflict? You know, a lot of people seem worried about it, with red lines being crossed and, you know, what's going on. Just a bit of a worry. What's your thoughts on it? Where do you think we're going to end up with all this?
Well, I've spoken about this many times, and in the last show I showed you the book that I'm reading now, which I think I thought about doing it tonight. Maybe I'll do it on Wednesday. I'll read you just from the prologue. The rest of the book is astounding. So don't not buy the book, because I'm going to read you a bit of the prologue. But the prologue is so blood-chilling that anyone in their right mind who wants their leaders to continue down the path which leads to nuclear war really needs their head examined. It is so horrific. It's horrific beyond even my imagination, and I have a vivid one. It's horrific beyond anybody's imagination, and these are official American government scientific analysis about the impact of a single nuclear weapon landing on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. I'll read a bit on Wednesday. It will make your blood run cold. In fact, I'll read it before Wednesday for my Patreons. Gayatri, if you can make note of that. And then I'll read some to the show on Wednesday. Amy in Birmingham on the US and UK politics. Go ahead, Amy.
Yes, hello. Good evening. It's an honor to speak to you, Mr. George.
Thank you, sir.
I would like to say that the USA is leading the UK and Europe into a big war. And as we see today in Ukraine and what's happening, and with the USA nuclear weapons being scattered around the UK shores, I would believe in the future the Europeans and British people will take a stand. And I believe in the next 10 years, people may realize that the biggest enemy in the world is the USA and the Pentagon, CIA, FBI. They are a real threat to our lives, to our families, to our health, education. They are involved in everything that we consume today. Our food is being poisoned. And so from what I can see, that in the future we'll have one enemy and only one enemy, and it's the USA.
Well, I'm with you on that, up to a point, Amy. My only caveat would be we might not have 10 years. We might not be here in 10 years. I don't just mean me or you, but none of us might be here in 10 years. It's that serious. Let's have a nuclear discussion on Wednesday. Alan is in Wigan in England on Ukraine. Go ahead, Alan.
Hello, George. Can you hear me?
Hi.
It's a
Yeah,
pleasure
very
and a
clear. Go
privilege
ahead.
to talk to you, George. I'm a first-time caller, and I'd like to talk about what Sergei Lavrov said this week about Western countries playing with matches, like children playing with matches. I thought it was absolutely pure gold. I think the man is a giant among all the pygmies. And this nonsense in Ukraine has got to stop, because we are on the edge of a nuclear war. People don't even know it. I mean, I've been thrown out of funeral wakes because of my opinions regarding Vladimir Putin, and everybody's horrified when I talk to them about it. I just can't get over the lies the mainstream media spin. I mean, how do we get through? I mean, I listened to Donna before, and it was a parallel talk, really, about what their experience is about Palestine, but mine's all about Ukraine. And don't get me wrong, what's going on in the Middle East is so wrong, it's disgusting. But how can we get through, George, to people? Your thoughts?
Well, again, we've got to keep trying. My experience is not quite the same as yours. I meet a lot of people who might not announce it at a wedding or a funeral, but I meet quite a lot of people who respect and even admire Putin. And they say things like, well, he stands up for his own people. I wish we had a government that stood up for us. And I think that's quite a powerful message. When Putin came to power in Russia, it was lying on the floor, drunk, with its nose bleeding, and the Western oligarchs picking its pocket. Drunk in the form of Boris Yeltsin. Look at it now. In 21 years, Putin has completely transformed Russia. Russia is a glorious success story. I know the enemies don't want to hear that, but that requires them not to look at the footage freely available of what development is like in Russia. That the average Russian, in fact, the average Chinaman, is now better off than the average European. That's a fact. The average Russian, the average Chinese citizen, is better off than the average European citizen. Now, some might say, but there's no freedom. But that's becoming a rather hollow claim, considering we've been talking all night about how our freedoms are being taken away. The truth is, Putin picked Russia up, put it back on its feet, dusted it down, cleaned its nose, cleaned out many, but not nearly enough, of the oligarchs that had robbed Russia in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and has made it a powerful, respected, and yes, by some feared country again in the world, none of which seemed likely when Boris Yeltsin was lying on the ground having his pocket picked. So most people know that Putin has been a successful leader for Russia. And they look at our own leaders in Britain, in the United States, and they ask, have our leaders been successful leaders? Nobody could claim that any recent British Prime Minister has been a successful leader. And nowadays we have them in a revolving door, and it's getting worse all the time. So events on the ground, Alan, are marching ineluctably for a sweeping and swift Russian victory. The Donbass front is collapsing. The Battle of the Bulge in Kursk has completely failed. 7,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. The others are trapped, cannot escape, will be crushed. and Russia did not remove a single soldier from the Donbass front in order to do that. Russia is unbeatable militarily. I'm watching with my sons at the moment on Netflix the new World War II 6-part documentary. Just watch it, for God's sake, and shake yourselves of this absurd idea that Russia is ever going to allow itself to be defeated. Alan in Wigan, thank you. SZJ5 says the West has corrupted the Arab leaders by installing dictators, removing Islamic rulers, doing deals with them to prop them up, and have USA bases and torture centers to keep the people suppressed. And You Can't Handle the Truth says when you have the owner of X making US deep state political statements, X was no longer a free speech platform. No, it isn't a free speech platform, but it's more free than some others, and it's freer than it used to be under its previous owners. Elin Grom says when fascism comes to the West, it will come in the guise of liberalism. One of the smarter things Ronald Reagan said. Indeed so. Speaking of Ronald Reagan, formerly of the parish of California, let's go to California, where Tim is on the line on the U.S. economy. Go ahead, Tim.
Good afternoon, George. That was a great show as always. I appreciate you. God bless you and your family. I was just watching Savvy Sabs about the $150,000 giveaway in the legislature right now in California. George, I'm 66, retired Teamster truck driver. The prices here, 20% inflation. The attitude of the people is unbelievably strange. I don't want to say violent, but meanly rude. I'm sure there's a word for that, but that's the best I can do right now. I've never seen times like this before. I'm just so concerned about my children and grandchildren, really. That's about all I have to say, George. Love your show.
Let me
God
ask
bless
you then. Thanks, Tim. God bless you. Let me ask you this, though. Are the people, this inflation is truly unbelievable. It's nearly 25% in the period of Biden and Harris being in office. Are the people blaming them, Tim?
It's so strange, George. Most people are so concerned about just their everyday life, about paying bills, about taking their kids to the football, soccer games. We live in a centrifuge, and most of them are either in denial or, I don't know, George. What do you think?
False consciousness abounds. Tim, long live the Teamsters. I take my hat off to you. Jack is in Sydney, down under, where it must be very, very early in the morning. Jack, thanks for joining us. What do you want to say?
Good morning from Sydney, and you're right, George. It is early, but it's springtime, and I thought, hey, it's time as a long-time listener, as so many of your callers say, to make a phone call. I'm a presenter of an Irish radio community program here in Sydney called Celtic FM, and this is a question that's been on my mind for some time, which I thought would interest you with your recent visit to Rome. I've often wondered why the Pope has not excommunicated people like Tony Blair and Joe Biden, although I guess in the past there has been form with people, the Jesuit-educated Idi Amin in Uganda. That's my first part of the question. And secondly, why hasn't the Catholic Church elevated Bethlehem as a home, once again, in that region, in the Holy Land, for the Catholic Church?
Well, two very good questions indeed, Jack. First of all, I'm very glad to make your acquaintance. I'm familiar with your radio station, Celtic AM, FM, and it would be lovely to talk to you at greater length. Gayatri and I met the Pope for a private audience just a few months ago. It was a private audience, so I can't divulge word for word what was said by us to him or him to us. That would be improper. He might excommunicate me. But it is an astounding thing that someone like Joe Biden, who openly proselytizes against the church dogma, who openly breaks the commandments of the church, can still take communion in a Catholic church in Delaware, as is his wont. It is astounding. Blair went to the Vatican before he became a Catholic, and the Pope, then Pope, beseeched him not to invade Iraq. But he said that God was talking to him, or that was George Bush, his sparring partner, his shotgun man. George Bush said God was talking to him and told him he had to invade Iraq. Well, the Pope was talking to Tony Blair, telling him not to invade Iraq. But Blair did it anyway, and parades around the world as a Roman Catholic, presumably in good standing. I simply don't understand how that is possible. I mean, clearly, there's nothing to be excommunicated from if Biden and Blair cannot be excommunicated from the church. The church stands for nothing if people like that can openly go there, kiss the Pope's ring in the Vatican, all the while proselytizing openly and legislating openly in absolute contradiction and defiance of church doctrine. On the second point, even more important, Bethlehem. Do I need to say it twice? Jerusalem. Nazareth. Do I need to say these things twice? How is it? We know why these evangelicals love Israel, hate the Palestinians, because they want to bring about the end pretty damn quick, soon as they can. The end times, the rapture, the final battle, at which point Jews will have to convert to Christianity or be put to the sword. That's what they want. But why are the Catholics not up in arms in defense of Jesus' people in Bethlehem? Beats me, Jack. Wish I had an answer to give you, but I can't. I don't. Heng Nung, says Gigi, David Kelly and Minister Robin Cook warned the House of Commons there were no WMDs in Iraq. Both were dead 1 year later. And Gisela says, George, I love your suits. You're always styling. Who picks your wardrobe? Well, here she is here, my good wife, Gayatri. You pick my wardrobe, that's a given. But people should know it's all second-hand. It's all vintage. All of my clothes are vintage. They're all pre-loved.
All pre-loved. All pre-loved from charity. And you are exactly wearing the one. I must tell the audience, I must share with the audience the secret that I bought this from a very shabby charity shop, shall we say. You've got nicer ones, you've got shabbier ones, and we were in an emergency. I got into the shabby charity shop, and I got this tie for less than a $5.
It was
way under a $5.
It's Burberry.
And it's Burberry.
£4 for a Burberry tie. She has an eye for a bargain. That's why she got me.
I was born in the Netherlands and grew up amongst the Dutch, so I do know how to save a penny.
Indeed. Tell us what's rattling on social media.
So, is fascism coming to the West? An overwhelmingly clear poll this week, albeit maybe not everyone understanding the concept of fascism as such. Graham Briggs White says on Patreon, What I fear is that we are witnessing the final stages of merger between corporation and state.
That is fascism.
This is what
That
Mussolini.
is fascism.
What Mussolini
coined by Mussolini was
coined.
exactly that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, we've got that right.
Freedom of speech is gone, he says, and at least in 2 countries we are backing fascist ideologies. They would rather back the far right than allow us socialism.
Sure. In Netanyahu and Zelensky, we are openly on the side of fascist brutes, one of which wears the regalia of fascism, the other merely practices the subhumanization and annihilation of a dehumanized, subhumanized people in the way that fascism does. Yeah, he's right. And freedom of speech is not gone, but it's definitely going.
Well, we've got the founder of Telegram. He was arrested in Paris. I mean, what a contradiction. Netanyahu,
He was handcuffed.
Netanyahu can continue his massacres in Gaza and now the West Bank, as you have been elaborating on. But the founder of Telegram is taken into prison. The other point discussed in regarding to the poll is, well, okay, it's already been here. Most people are arguing fascism has always been here. It's never left. It's just been in disguise. But since when? Some are saying since the Victorian times. Some are saying 70s, 90s. Ellie McCarthy says Operation Paperclip was the foundation of the mid-20th century to keep it going. I fear we have always had a form of fascism in the West. And David Nimmo says fascism is already here, disguised as woke liberalism. Torture is okay, murder is okay, genocide is okay.
Stick a rainbow on it.
Yes, stick a rainbow on it. It has been coming for a long time. We should have realized that when we knew what was happening to JFK and he was assassinated. So he's coining JFK
as you know, that's my date, November 1963, murder most foul. It wasn't just Kennedy who was killed. It was America that was killed. And I would date the long descent in which we are now very truly, well and truly sunk from that date. But we could argue about the dates.
We can argue about the dates. Now, Carl Morris emails in saying that Shereen, our first guest, he was very touched by the interview with her. She is literally talking for me. I feel so helpless with this genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. It continues without sanction, without actions by the UN. They're just words, words, words with no consequences.
Sure, but I worry about that kind of descent into fatalism. Look, there are protests. Join them. There are marches. There are petitions. There are stalls. The Workers' Party of Britain is the Palestine Party as well as the party of many other things, but its platform on Palestine could not be better. Its leader, if I may say so, could not be stronger. So join us. You can do something. Don't just retreat into the personal world, because that way lies depression and surrender.
Exactly, just like you were saying to our caller from Panama, is it, Donna?
Yeah.
Keep going. Maybe you haven't reached there yet, but keep going. We keep going. Susie says, remember during the Ukraine-Russia war when we were encouraged to take on Ukrainian children and their families? Well, where's that cry to help Palestinian children?
They're not even allowed in
Exactly.
Britain.
I mean, they're not even allowed.
They're allowed in America, but not in Britain.
No, so...
If we wanted to take some of these poor children that we saw online to get medical treatment here in Britain, they would not be allowed in. Imagine that.
Imagine that. Finally, still on Palestine, John writes, polio is not contagious. Polio was caused by toxic chemicals, particularly DDT. It is no surprise to me that there's an outbreak of polio in Gaza. It's the most toxic place on earth right now. The polio vaccine was not introduced until 1955. Polio was well on the way out before the vaccine was introduced. So introducing polio vaccines into Gaza has nothing to do with helping Palestinians. It is simply a different type of genocide ammunition.
Well, this kind of thing is dangerous nonsense. Polio is highly contagious. vaccination against it does work. You said 1955. By 1958, I myself had been vaccinated against it. Twice, actually. Once with an injection, the other time with a sugar lump. And polio was wiped out in Western countries. It was completely wiped out. And yet, I grew up with children wearing what I call calipers. I don't know if people know what that means. They were basically metal and leather constructions that the kids had to put around their legs so that they could walk. I grew up with people in wheelchairs because of polio. I saw pictures of people in iron lungs, they were called. Terrified me. Spent their life lying flat with an iron contraption breathing for them. Polio is deadly dangerous. And the fact that we still have not got even a 3-day pause before the slaughter resumes in order to inoculate the children of Gaza from polio is an absolute disgrace in a sea of disgrace. Is that all you've got for now? It's all the time we've got from now.
Yeah,
Thanks,
let's go to the
Gayatri.
line.
I'll take you for chips. Later, Tyrone is in California on Israel. Go ahead, Tyrone.
Hi, George. Nice to speak to you again. And Bob Dylan, who I know you like, is also a great dresser. He never gets enough credit for how well he dresses, but I wanted to put that out there. And I wanted to express admiration for the way you accept input, which very few people do. In fact, you look for it. And that just shows the solid moral ground that you stand on. And yeah, you're not trying to put anything across. To be interesting, you have to be interested, I always say. And you're interested in what people say. I want to talk about a couple things about Israel, which I say Israel is a crime, posing as a country, hiding behind a religion. And, your metaphor of a gangrenous leg is good. I'd like to add some adjustment to that. I think it's a monstrous, like a mad scientist doing an operation. The mad scientist is the UN, which of course the monster always turns against its creator. And it's like sewing a thumb where a nose should be, or some other appendage, floppy appendage where a thumb should be. The body rejects it ultimately. And
I think that's very powerful. That's very powerful. I commend to you Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, by Mary Shelley, born in my hometown of Dundee, which makes your point, Tyrone, that the monster not only eventually turns against its creator, but because it is a monster, is able easily to overwhelm its creator. And we must be pretty close to that now. The United Nations is close to being wiped out, physically, extirpated from Gaza. Last word to you, Tyrone.
And the United States and England, which I agree with Duncan, should be considered occupied territories, for sure, the government and the media. And like the parasite that's almost finished devouring its host, it's the crazy stuff that the United States does makes sense when you consider that a bunch of treasonous operatives have taken over the government, have taken over the media, and it goes back to this mafia intelligence military complex. And the problem is that decent people
I saw
don't
Kennedy's latest campaign ad, Tyrone. I don't know if you saw RFK Jr., whose views on Israel-Palestine are not just anathema to me, but inexplicable to me. But on other matters, he has a new campaign ad. It is worth looking up if you haven't seen it. Some of it is from California, from the murder of his father, RFK, the first. It shows how long this descent has been. It's not long historically, but it's long in the life of a man, but it has been one long, slow fall that we have been on. Tyrone in California, do come back another time, because I must go to the last call of the show. The original legend, Norma, in Bristol, on nuclear disarmament. Norma, welcome.
Hello, George. No, you're on about people's special moments. And I heard Professor E.P. Thompson a long time ago and on the dangers of nuclear weapons. And he was the most brilliant speaker. And people in Bristol, they queued all the way down the stairs. We couldn't get into the building. And it had a powerful effect on me. And so did Bruce Kemp, because he was Catholic, and he's dead now. But, I mean, all the billions of pounds spent on these nuclear weapons, and actually, we don't know the consequences nowadays are not being told if we actually did have a nuclear war. And it really needs to be spelled out to people. Because, well, E.P. Thompson, he was brilliant, George.
He was. I heard him speak many times, read his words many times. I walked 500 miles with then Monsignor Bruce Kent, later Bruce Kent, the General Secretary of CND. I walked from Faslane, nuclear weapons base in Scotland, to Burgfield, the American nuclear weapons base in the south of England. We spoke at public meetings every single night, which were completely ignored by the mass media, and we didn't have social media then, but every single meeting was packed out. This was in the mid-1980s, in the last big wave of anti-nuclear war mass movements, which, like you, I'm rather surprised we don't have again today. But you've confirmed in my mind that Wednesday's show, we're going to dive deeply into the mushroom cloud in a bid to try and stop it from happening. Thank you, Norma, as always. Thanks to all the callers. Thanks to those who didn't get through. Well over 100 people didn't get through and were hanging on the line tonight. I'm particularly sorry to them, and promise priority for them if they do call back again in subsequent shows. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. These are tumultuous times. These are dark times. But everyone has an obligation to do what they can to take us out of the darkness. And this, the MOATS, is a light in the darkness. And we're shining on like a diamond. Stay tuned.